Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. I have two guests today, both of whom have been on the podcast before. And my first guest is David Abulafia, who is Professor of History at the University of Cambridge. David wrote a very famous book, The Great Sea, about the history of the Mediterranean, and that's going to be the subject of today's episode. So welcome back, David, to the podcast.
Very nice to be back.
Now, because the history of the Mediterranean is such a massive topic, David and I have agreed we're going to try and break it down into chunks. And today's episode, we're going to focus in on ancient times. So basically from the distant past up to about the year 600. And because we're talking about ancient history, I thought it might be a good idea to invite my favorite ancient historian to join us. So welcome back, Brett Devereaux, to the podcast.
Good to be here.
And for those of you who don't know him, Brett is Assistant Teaching Professor of History at the University of North Carolina and is the author of a massively popular blog which covers a vast range of subjects in the field of ancient history. And before we get going, Brett, do you want to just say a little bit about what your blog is all about, just as a starter?
Right. We cover on the blog, I mean, essentially it is, as all blogs are, the blog of things which interest me, and apparently other people, which befuddles me. We cover a range of ancient history topics, both ancient history as it appears in popular culture, particularly ancient military history as it appears in popular culture, but also broader historical topics, how things were made in the past. We've done farming, blacksmithing, and now textile production, how this was done before industrial technology, that sort of thing. So people should check it out.
If you haven't come across it, strongly recommend it. Turning to the subject of today's show, and I wasn't quite sure where to kick off because it's such a vast subject. You know, we could have started anywhere, but I wanted to start perhaps with one of the great cities of the Mediterranean, namely Alexandria. So, David, do you want to just give us a very brief explanation of how Alexandria came into being?
It's an extraordinary story, actually. And to me, what it underlines is, well, to use a fancy word, sort of contingency, agency, all these terms that my fellow historians love to conjure up. But what I'm really talking about is the way in which an almost random decision by a particular individual can transform the history of, well, actually the world, because it doesn't just affect the Mediterranean, but the Indian Ocean as well. And, the city for centuries and centuries was such an important place, at times the most important city in the Mediterranean. Right, so what we're looking at is the period when Alexander the Great is at the peak of his power, and he manages, having marched through what's now Lebanon and what's now Israel, on the way having massacred the inhabitants of the city of Tyre because they resisted him. But he comes into Egypt, and Egypt was under the rule of a Persian satrap, a sort of deputy of the Persian ruler, and he takes control there. And of course, you can imagine he is captivated by what he sees in Egypt, this ancient civilization worshipping these extraordinary gods. So we're told by Plutarch, the biographer of so many of the figures from the ancient world about whom we know anything really, he tells us that Alexander had a dream, and this dream, which I think also included a visitation by Homer, but maybe that was a different dream. I mean, he was on sort of, very chummy terms with people like Homer. And what it told him to do was to found a city at a place called Pharos on the north coast of Egypt, in an area which lay actually rather to the west of where historically most of, not all, but many of the trading centres through the centuries had been. They tended to be in the mouth of the Nile, places like Damietta and various ancient Egyptian Greek sites and so on. But it's a bit to the west of that, and it's on a sort of spit of land, rocky spit of land between the sea and a freshwater lake. So it's very long and thin. And he was promised in his dream by the god Zeus or whoever that it was a very good place to found a harbour, and I beg to differ, actually. I think partly because of this very rocky base on which he was going to build his city. I mean, what you're actually looking at is it's also quite a rocky entry into the.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I'm wondering if you lost connection.
Sorry, I lost the connection. Did you lose the connection?
Mm-hmm.
What was the last bit you... Yeah. It was a poor place for a harbour because ships coming in had to negotiate, well, as they often did in harbours, but they had to negotiate between all these sort of rocks and outcrops and so on. And this then led to a rather brilliant solution in a way, which was to build on a particular sort of outcrop, to build a lighthouse. And this lighthouse, which was given the name Pharos, which was the place, if you remember, in the dream that Alexander had been told to choose for the site of his new city, this lighthouse then became the epitome of all lighthouses, which, in Greek became known by the name Pharos. You've got in Sicily, for instance, the Faro, the Straits of Messina, and so on. So that was a sort of solution. The lighthouse became one of the wonders of the world. We don't quite know how it operated, though people do have increasingly good ideas about how the light was actually sort of flashed across the waters. And eventually it was dismantled after the Arab conquest of the city in the 7th century. A fortress now stands where it was, a Mamluk fortress in the late Middle Ages, so you can visit that. A lot of the building materials were reused in the building of medieval Alexandria. So you had this area, this very long, narrow area. I'm dealing with several kilometres long, about 3 miles long, this area, and quite narrow. And the next question was how to lay out the city. So traditionally, one chose a sort of grid plan. This was something which went back to earlier classical usage. And so in order to do this, we're told, well, there was a problem about sort of getting enough materials to lay out the grid. So what he did was he actually he sort of he expropriated large amounts of barley in sacks, and the barley was used to sketch out where the roads would be. And then, of course, predictably, all the birds in Egypt came to eat the barley. But that actually, when people saw the birds eating the barley, they knew exactly, therefore, what the sort of ground plan was. It was actually more effective in a way than barley, which after all would get blown away by the wind eventually and be pretty invisible. So they built this long, narrow city, and it began, this is 331 BC, they began to attract migrants. Greeks began to settle there. Large numbers of Jews came down from Palestine, and it became, those were the two groups which are perhaps best known in the history of Alexandria. But there was something very important about all of this was the idea of where Alexandria was. Now you might just say, well, it was in Egypt, wasn't it? But not quite as simple as that, because you've got this sort of gap, you've got this lake to the south, and it became known by this phrase, Alexandria ad Egyptum. Alexandria, now this word ad, meaning sort of towards, on the edge of, really, Egypt. And this was something which was, it sort of stayed in people's memory and usage. It was revived, this concept was revived very much actually in the 19th century to justify the argument that Alexandria was a sort of European city, a sort of an outcrop of Europe on the edge of Egypt, rather than actually an Egyptian city, which in some ways was true in those areas by the sea, which were inhabited by Greeks and Italians and Maltese and all sorts of other groups of people in very large numbers. So what he managed to do was to found a city which wasn't simply an Egyptian city, the first really large Egyptian city which engaged, in my view, I mean, Brett may disagree, but which really engaged with the Mediterranean. And it's therefore a sort of Mediterranean city, not just an Egyptian city.
It seems strange to me that this is a time, and perhaps it's slightly beyond the time, where new cities are founded. And I guess unusually, we actually know who did found the city. We know it was Alexander. And I guess the only other city that we know for sure, well, probably there are others that you'll be able to tell me about, but the other great city we know for sure who founded it is Constantinople. Mm. But this wave of colonization that comes from the Greeks and from others, I'm sort of told by my historians that these are the days where people don't live too long because, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So where do these populations come from to found all these new Greek and other colonies across the Mediterranean?
I don't think it's so difficult to think of where they were coming from, given, as I've said, that there were, for instance, let's take the case of the Jews who moved down, it wasn't a great distance for them, moved down to Alexandria, and who had developed rather a sort of nice relationship with Alexander. He'd been actually quite sort of protective of them as he passed by Jerusalem. And they started naming a lot of their children Alexander ever afterwards, actually, to this day. It's quite a common Jewish name. So, there were people who were sort of attracted by the news that this great new commercial city was coming into existence. The Hellenistic world, that is to say, the world that was coming into being with Alexander's conquests, with the spread of Greek culture across the Eastern Mediterranean and indeed way beyond as far as India, was a world in which it was easier to move around perhaps, and in which all sorts of commercial activities, if you look at that whole period from Alexander right through to the beginnings of the Roman Empire, to the period of Augustus, you've got a number of centres of trade emerging in the Eastern Mediterranean, not just Alexandria, but Rhodes and later Delos, the island, the Holy Island, lying between the Greek mainland and Turkey. So we're looking at quite a lively commercial world. And so a port would act as a magnet, drawing people towards it from all directions. And of course, also people coming up from the south, from Egypt. And one of the ways in which the rulers, the Ptolemies, the successors to Alexander, dealt with this was trying to create these syncretistic cults, these religious cults that drew together elements of both Greek and Egyptian religion, even sort of inventing a new god, Serapis, who was sort of based on a couple of Egyptian gods and then all sorts of Greek elements thrown in. And this cult actually took off very successfully. So this was something which provided perhaps a sense of unity among the population, not the Jewish population. I mean, they had their own beliefs, but the rest of the population being drawn to that. So you get the emergence of a sort of Greco-Egyptian culture, a very strong Greco-Egyptian culture. And there had actually, of course, been Greek settlers in that area for many centuries. There had been trading centres. The Greeks, if you go right back to the Mycenaean period, to the Bronze Age, you've got Minoan Mycenaean traders coming into Egypt. It was a very well-established connection between the Greek world and particularly the Nile Delta.
Brett, do you want to say a bit about the Ptolemies and how well they played together with the other children of Alexander, so to speak?
Well, none of the children of Alexander played together particularly well. Alexandria in Egypt obviously fits in a program of colonization, both under Alexander and subsequently. Alexandria is by far the most significant of the Alexandrias. Alexander liked naming cities after himself. Plutarch, I believe, tells us that there were at least 80 foundations under Alexander. And his successors kept it up. Part of the problem was the military concern. The Macedonian military that Alexander brought, he made some effort to incorporate Persian aristocrats into his military system. It didn't go very well. It remained a significantly ethnically Macedonian and ethnically Greek military. And so Alexander's successors have a problem. They are convinced that they need Greek speakers, be they Macedonian or Greek, to make up the heavy infantry in their formations. But unless you are the Antigonids who have the good or bad fortune to end up in Macedon proper, obviously you don't have a large Greek population. And so they're inviting a large Greek population. Alexandria isn't the only place in Egypt where we see the Ptolemies, the successors of Alexander, bringing in Greek colonists. They're doing land grants, large land grants, for instance, on the Fayum Oasis, which is a little bit further upriver on the Nile, where the area has to be drained to be made farmable. And we have, because of the unique preservation conditions of Egypt, actually a fair lot of papyrus evidence for who's getting set up here, and they're military settlers. So they're essentially, the Ptolemies are putting the word out, we have land. If you're a Greek speaker and you want to move to Egypt, we will give you a farm, and in exchange, you and your sons will be liable to serve in the army. And this will be the deal. They're doing this, of course, because they are locked in a forever war with the other heirs of Alexander, particularly Seleucus and his heirs, over exactly who's going to control Syria.
And can you say a bit, because I was fascinated by it, these massive sea battles that they have, and not just the massive sea battles, but the massive ships that they have. And a question I kind of want to ask both you and David is, do we believe in some of these ships, in the sense that people talk about it? But they talk about triremes, and everybody seems to agree that, yes, they had 3 banks of oars. And I'm just thinking, really? What kind of leverage could you get on that third bank? And so I'm kind of interested to know, what did these fleets look like, and how practical were they?
So we've reconstructed a trireme, the Olympias. You can go see it. It's in Greece. These days in a museum. I don't believe it does sea trials anymore, but they've done it. And so it does work. Naturally, you've got to get that third bank of oars, and in a trireme, they are stacked more or less vertically. You have to get that third bank of oars pretty close to the water level, which means getting that first bank of oars really close to the water level, which is part of why every time there's even so much as a slight gust, it seems like Greek fleets are vanishing below the waves. But for a trireme, its primary offensive attribute is its ram, so speed is both its offense and its defense, and so it's worth it to construct a somewhat less seaworthy ship in order to be faster. They're built for speed. They're built light. Now, the trireme emerges as the sort of the standard warship in the very late 500s BC. It really gets its sort of day in the sun through the 400s. By Alexander's day, the Greeks, so the late 300s, the Greeks are beginning to experiment with larger and heavier warships, and they have a convenient numbering system based on the number of rowers on a side. So a trireme has 3 rowers on 3 oars stacked vertically. Then you have what the Greeks would have called a tetrareme, and the Romans called a quadriremus, or a quadreme, or we could just say a 4. We're just going to keep life simple. A 4 as a trireme is a 3. That has 2 sets of oars on each side, but probably 2 rowers per oar, which gives you 4. Then you add a third oar on the top, as with the trireme. Now you have 5 rowers. That's your quinquireme, or for the Greeks, your pentareme. These ships are larger and heavier. There's quite a bit of debate about exactly why these larger and heavier ships are being built. I am convinced by William Murray's argument that the purpose of the 4s and 5s and 6s is probably frontal ramming. You don't want to ram head on head with a trireme. They're not built that heavy. But with these heavier ships, you probably could, and there are some indications in the sources that that's what they're for. So you would put your lighter triremes on the flanks of the fleet where they could do their fancy maneuvers. In the center, where there wasn't enough space to maneuver, you put these heavy polyremes. But then as we get after Alexander, the engineers of the Greek world keep going. We have not just 5s and 6s, but 7s and 8s and 9s and 10s and 11s and 13s and 14s and 15s and 18s and 20s, a few 30s, and then one absolutely spectacular Tessaconteres, a 40. And certainly there are some questions about these larger ships. I mean, it does seem like the 8s, the 9s, the 10s, and the 11s did do fighting. They show up in battles. William Murray has argued that they were probably primarily intended as siege platforms for attacking coastal cities. I think there's something to be said for that. In any event, it's hard to say because the Romans and the Carthaginians looked at everything above a 6 and said, that's impractical and silly and we won't build them. And so they didn't. Roman and Carthaginian fleets used typically 6s as flagships, 5s as the main line ships, although we're finding out with archaeology, the Romans were using more triremes than we originally thought. These wonderful finds off of the Agadi Islands, people should check out, just Google RPM Nautical to find these finds of the Battle of the Agadi Islands that were pulling rams off the bottom of the ocean. Absolutely fascinating, one of the biggest archaeological finds, underwater archaeological finds in decades. But these fleets they're much bigger and they're much larger. Part of this has to do with the resources involved. If you are the Ptolemies, and naturally it is a Ptolemy that builds that 40, that Tessaconteres, which is probably just intended as a fancy display piece, it's hard to imagine that such a massive ship could do any fighting. If you are the Ptolemies, you have absolutely stunning amounts of revenue to throw at your problems. Indeed, the standard Ptolemaic problem was they had all of the money and never enough manpower. They had all of this revenue, but getting good soldiers was difficult. Michael Taylor has recently estimated the income of the revenues of the Ptolemaic state very, very roughly at 9 million drachma per year.
What's that in pounds, shillings, and pence?
Putting it in pounds, shillings, and pence would be hard. It's something like 4 to 5 times the income of the Roman Republic on the eve of the Second Punic War.
Okay.
It's a truly massive amount of money. The Ptolemaic kingdom was, without a doubt, at its height, the richest state on the Mediterranean. And that money flows into building these supersized, in some cases, vanity project warships. Of course, that money also flows into building up Alexandria as a capital befitting an heir of Alexander. It flows into the library. It flows into the public buildings. It flows into attracting migrants from Greece, from Macedon, from the Levant. It flows into attracting trade. A lot of this money is being produced by much of the taxes of Egypt under the Ptolemies are collected in kind, in grain. The grain is then shipped out of Egypt and sold in the Mediterranean for cash as a way of monetizing this traditional taxation in kind. And so Alexandria, the city, is like the Ptolemaic navy, the beneficiary of truly stunning amounts of money. Ptolemies are rich in a way that
nobody else before or since, maybe.
Right.
You mentioned the library, and I was taken, David, in your book, you sort of debunk some of the, well, I wouldn't say myths exactly, but you talk about where the library started and ended. Do you want to say a bit about the library? Because I thought that was interesting.
Well, it was an amazing project, actually. I mean, it wasn't entirely unique. There were other rulers, the ruler of Pergamon, for instance, who in the Eastern Mediterranean, who also built up a very fine library. There was even a rivalry between these rulers to have the best library. But the idea of collecting all these texts, I mean, there's still a number of problems with understanding exactly what was going on. There was a main library, there was a subsidiary library. We're not quite sure. We have a story of the burning of the library at the time of Julius Caesar. We have stories about the burning of the library at the time of the Arab invasion, the seizure of the city by the Arabs in 640, by which time perhaps there weren't any books in the library. But let's say that there were about 80,000, and we're talking about rolls of books, many of them containing a whole series of texts. Now, all right, so they built up this library. It wasn't like a public library that we're sort of familiar with, where anybody could sort of turn up and just sort of get a ticket and come in every day. You had to get an invitation. But what is really interesting is that the core of this library, this wasn't just a library, it was actually a sort of an intellectual academy, a sort of research institute in a way, with its group of scholars. And some of the people who were involved in running the library were very remarkable figures, distinguished poets, Callimachos, and perhaps the most attractive really to a modern reader, Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote a rather wonderful little epic. It's not quite in the style of Homer, but it obviously owes a lot to Homer, about Jason and the Argonauts and this great expedition to find the Golden Fleece. So there was this great collection, and it wasn't a collection simply of Greek texts. We know that texts were being translated, and the one that is actually still in use in certainly the Greek Orthodox Church to this day, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the so-called Septuagint, which was, according to legend, translated by 72 learned rabbis, shall we call them, and they were each put in a sort of separate box and told to get on with the translating without consulting with one another. And lo and behold, at the end of all this, all 72 versions were taken out and compared, and they turned out to be identical. So this obviously had complete authority. Well, you might say that, but actually, if you compare the text, and this is why actually also in both Greek Orthodox and in Catholic Bibles, which owe quite a lot to the translation of the Septuagint, you will find various biblical books that are not in either the Jewish or the Protestant Bible, what we call the Apocrypha. Extra stories added on, most famously. We've got extra bits of Daniel, extra bits of Esther. We've got the story of the Maccabees and so on. And so we also have variants in the text, which are not part of the Jewish tradition, showing that there wasn't actually a settled text, which people would like to think, but it wasn't actually the case. There wasn't actually a settled text in the Ptolemaic period of some of the most ancient parts of the Bible, Book of Genesis, Exodus, and so on. So it's actually a very important text. But what is really sad about the books themselves is that, well, there may be a case for just the occasional tiny scrap that survived, but really nothing can be identified among all the manuscripts that have survived as a survival from the Alexandrian library. It's all gone now, and probably had gone over many centuries, books being stolen. You weren't supposed to take books out of the library, but people did, of course. And deterioration of the papyrus. They were written on this sort of Egyptian version, sort of pre-paper, but quite similar in some respects to paper. And destruction by fire, as I've said. So all those lost works that we would love to have by the great classical authors. I mean, they summoned from Athens, they actually tricked the Athenians into sending them their number one manuscripts of the great Greek dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. All these were sent to Egypt on the understanding a deposit was paid by the Alexandrian library, and it was understood they would be sent back. But in fact, they didn't. So they refused to send them back. They held on to them because they wanted, of course, the Ptolemies wanted to have the very best texts. But a great many plays, we've got 7 plays by Aeschylus, a great many more have simply disappeared.
So it wasn't a copying library. It wasn't like the Christians who had their scribes copying away. Once it came into the library, it wasn't then copied and sent out to other people.
Well, I don't think we really know about that, to the extent to which books were actually being reproduced for readers. It's an interesting point whether, for instance, one of the reasons people might have got tickets, as it were, those who were allowed in, whether they were actually reproducing text to send. For instance, you could imagine the Emperor Claudius, for instance, who was a very learned fellow, wanting to acquire an authoritative text and looking to Alexandria. I don't know. I mean, Brett, do you know of any evidence for that happening?
I don't know that we have any direct evidence, although this isn't quite my area of specialty, but I believe it is generally assumed that that's what's happening, that if you are a sort of elite wealthy person and you want a copy of a text and you want the best version of the text, you're going to send your scribe to Alexandria to get it, and he's going to copy their copy. And this is why I think, generally speaking, the classical canon itself is sort of the librarians of Alexandria in the process of essentially forming the classical canon, that their possession of this collection gives them a position of authority for someone like Callimachus to decide these are the best poets and worth copying, and these guys are rubbish and not worth copying, and so on. And so, certainly as a sort of an early hub for this kind of effort, though, by the time you get well into the Roman period, I think part of what's happening to the library is that it becomes less important because you have all sorts of other subsidiary libraries as you move into the Roman period. And so the Library of Alexandria as the sole repository for all of these sorts of works becomes less important and less necessary as the height of the Roman Empire leads to more libraries, more copying, relatively more availability. Of course, as David said, availability not afforded to us today, alas, because, papyrus, unless you bury it in the sands of Egypt, it does not keep. And so these works would have needed to have been recopied. It wasn't enough to put them on a shelf and not burn them.
The point about creating a canon is, of course, an important one. And this was being done by those librarians, by people like Callimachus and Apollonius. And what is really sad about this, of course, is that in a way they were excluding the literature of their own time. I mean, fortunately, some of their works have survived. But it became very much a canon built around, well, particularly Athenian literature. And there's so much that, indeed, they were probably ignoring that we would love to have.
Can I ask Brett a question? In your blog, you talk quite a lot about ancient technology. And there's something called, I think it's the Museon, which is a more practical, well, it's a less literary enterprise, and it seems a more technical enterprise. And you have some of the most brilliant minds, and they are scientific minds. And I'm always puzzled why this collection of, brilliant people don't move science forward in a practical way. And is there some sort of path dependency thing going on here, or do you have a theory about that?
A lot of it comes down to he who pays the piper calls the tune. When you look at quite a lot of ancient science and philosophy, and of course for these fellows, there isn't a distinction between those two fields, that they are researching and working on, often at a fairly high degree, the things that the people with money and concerns care about. So we see, for instance, in this period, the advancements in naval architecture must be considerable to build these larger ships. The advancements in siege technology are really significant. I mean, we go from the earliest catapults appearing in the 300s as very primitive devices, these belly bows, little more than jumbo-sized traditional bows, to very complex, sophisticated catapult technology that was very accurate and very powerful by the time we get to the Roman period. And the Romans are, as a side note, not developing this stuff. They're just taking it. It is right to learn even from the enemy. And so in fields where the kind of in a field where the kind of fellow like a Ptolemy cares deeply, there is a lot of thinking and innovation. When you get to questions of everyday work and life and farming and so on, the interests of the sorts of fellows who fund these kinds of ventures it's not nothing, but it's far more limited. Mm-hmm. And so there is a tendency towards, and you certainly see this in ancient technical treatises and discussions of marvels of engineering, there is a tendency towards the sort of flashy things that glorify kings and a tendency away from the sort of boring things that improve productivity. That's not to say, just to be clear, that there's no productivity going on. We see steady improvements over the Hellenistic period in the designs of olive presses and grain mills. We see improvements in, obviously, as we get into the Roman period and the emergence of water power and water mills to do a variety of things. Archimedes screws and more complex water draining mechanisms allowing deeper mines to be dug. Although to be fair, deeper mines are generally being dug for precious metals. You don't need to mine all that deep to get the iron you need. And so there is a movement forward of technology, and productive technology isn't entirely static in this period. That said, that movement it seems to be a lot of diffusion and a lot of trial and error, probably happening on the local level rather than being motivated by these sort of grand royal gestures of, I'm going to gather a bunch of philosophers together and see what they do. Those philosophers and mathematicians are far more likely to borrow from Syracuse and Archimedes to build you a better catapult or a better warship than a better plow. It's just what they're focused on.
Something one does need to remember is that there are names from the era of the Alexandria Library that we still sort of conjure with in the world of the sciences. I mean, Euclid, Eratosthenes, and his understanding of, the size and shape of the world. So there is a legacy there, which people tend not really to connect with that period. They just think, it's ancient Greece. They don't really understand that, in the Hellenistic period, when we're looking at a world of Greek culture that extends far beyond the Greek heartlands, this sort of work is being done in, for instance, Alexandria.
That is quite interesting because the Hellenistic times, I think, are considered to be a degeneration of ancient Greece. So it's neither Roman nor is it ancient Greece. It's sort of some sort of unsatisfactory middle period. At least that's always how I've perceived it, and somehow the propaganda of the time.
Yeah, indeed. When I was a student, in Cambridge, if you said when I was doing my ancient history course, said, I'd like to do some work on the Hellenistic period. Oh, no, we don't do that. I think Moses Finley was the famous ancient historian. I think he was getting interested in that period. But it was also bound up, I think, with a sense that that classical art went into a sort of decline. It became rather baroque, if you like, in the Hellenistic period, and the purity of the classical form had been lost. There was all that sort of idea which rendered it a sort of second-rate period culturally, and that is a misunderstanding, obviously.
Well, and perhaps, we should note that understanding, which I agree with David, is a misunderstanding. There's actually quite a lot going on in the Hellenistic period. It's rooted even in the term, right? Hellenistic is not an ancient term. It's a term coined by 19th century German historians who are essentially imbibing that very process we talked about where Callimachus and his confederates are defining the canon, and they define the classical period. And they define their own period, in essence, as lesser. Your sort of 19th century, again, predominantly German historians imbibe that. They accept it somewhat uncritically. And so they, term this period, Hellenistische, right? It's Greek-ish, which is sort of, it's already downgrading it. It seems to me that the Hellenistic period is in the field of classics making a bit of a slow comeback, although the pace is glacial, that it's getting a little bit more of the attention it deserves, but it certainly deserves more. Part of the problem, I will say, just from the perspective of trying to teach on it, is that at a survey course level, the politics of the Hellenistic period are so complex that it's very hard to give a in your big ancient history survey to really express their complexity, all the heirs of Alexander fighting, the wars of the Diadochoi, all of this stuff, in the time available.
There is this problem that everybody sort of homes in on Athens, and that has become the sort of measuring stick. Classical Athens, with a little bit about Sparta because it was the great enemy, And you just, people don't engage with that whole range of cities, Corinth is Thebes, and all these places just in the classical period tend to get ignored. And yet you think of the importance of Corinth in the early Greek trade routes, before Athens had really emerged as a major centre. It's interesting how people get fixated on particular places and their cultural importance. You have exactly the same in the Italian Renaissance with Florence, and everybody going on about Florence and ignoring all the other places where some really exciting innovations also took place.
Well, in poor ancient Syracuse, this big important city, it produces important philosophers and gets almost no attention because it's on the wrong island.
Yeah, even though Plato goes there. Exactly. Yeah.
So I kicked us off sort of in the middle of our period, and it was in the middle of the sea, I suppose it's in the east. but in a very particular place, a very particular period. So, David, can we kind of zoom back out again and just say a bit about the Mediterranean itself? And I'm interested to know why you call it the Great Sea, because I'd be inclined, if I was the Pacific Ocean, to look down my nose a bit at the Mediterranean. So could you just say a little bit about how the Mediterranean is formed, how it fits together, how the trade routes work, and just something about it, as a general entity?
I mean, I'm not an expert on geology, so I won't say anything about what happened millions and millions of years ago when it was a deep, dry depression that sort of opened up. The Straits of Gibraltar opened up and all the water came in. But what we do have to bear in mind, indeed, is that it's actually a very small area, and it actually accounts for 0.8% of the maritime surface of the globe. So that gives you some idea, compared to the Pacific, which covers 30% of the globe. In my subsequent book, The Boundless Sea, Human History of the Oceans, I have a section about the Pacific called The Oldest Ocean, because it is where the Polynesians millennia ago were heading outwards across the open sea, across distances far beyond anything you find in the Mediterranean. But that, in a way, takes me to the answer to your question. The point about the Mediterranean is that it is long and narrow, and it's therefore easy to maintain contact between the opposing sides. It contains several, within its own terms, large islands, Sicily and Sardinia being the two largest, but then we've also got Cyprus, Majorca, Corsica, and some various others which can act as sort of stopping points en route. In terms of weather during the year, all right, during the depths of winter, it might be thought to be dangerous to sail, though people did, when it was necessary to do so. But it's in this period, the period we're talking about, as far as we can see, conditions were suitable for moving around in a way that, if you compare the Indian Ocean, where you have to wait out the monsoons, where you have these enormous wind systems and currents, very different sort of environment. So it's an environment which is sort of amenable to humans. It's an environment which it's a sort of relatively welcoming environment. You actually think about how peoples like the Greeks thought about the Atlantic Ocean, that great okeanos, which was supposed to surround all the landed areas on Earth, and which was a rather forbidding area, though people did venture into it, certainly the Phoenicians and the Greek Pythias and so on. But the Mediterranean, therefore, was a more friendly sort of sea. All right, well, why call it the Great Sea? Well, there have been a number of books with, the obvious name, The Middle Sea. Not a very good book by the late Lord Norwich, but anyway, we won't go into that. I shouldn't be rude about my rivals. But what attracted me about this name, I suppose, is the fact that it's a name that takes one back to antiquity. It's not a modern invented name. It's the name that you find in the Bible. Yam Gadol, Great Sea. Now, what the ancient Israelites meant, they admittedly also used the term occasionally for other seas, Indian Ocean, etc. But the sea that they knew best was the Mediterranean. And from their perspective, this was the place where activity really happened through their allies, the Phoenicians in particular, who were by the time of King Solomon and his successors were ranging right across the Mediterranean from their end, from Lebanon, Israel, all the way through, indeed, the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic to Cadiz in the southwest of Spain and even beyond that. So that idea that it was seen by those who lived around its shores, it was their home sea, but it was also a great sea compared to other stretches of water that they know. I mean, after all, there's the Dead Sea, there's the Sea of Galilee, there's indeed the Black Sea and all these other places. But this was the big sea that they really knew about, and it was right in the center of the world. But there are some very beautiful names for it. I mean, in many ways, my favorite name is the Turkish name, Akdeniz, the White Sea, which is set against Karadeniz, which is the Black Sea, what we also call the Black Sea. I thought it's a lovely name, but nobody would understand it, of course.
Why did the Turks call it the White Sea, do you know?
I think probably having already given the name Karadeniz to the Black Sea, they thought of calling it. I should know the answer to that, shouldn't I? And these names do get very muddled up. I mean, we talk about the Red Sea, and that's partly a mistranslation from the Bible, and it's also a name which was sort of moved around. I mean, in the Greco-Roman period, the Indian Ocean was sometimes actually called the Red Sea by the Greeks. So we have to be a bit careful with all these colours. It's an obvious way to name seas. But the Great Sea, I mean, what I actually say at the end of the book is that even allowing for the enormous importance of those big oceanic spaces, the Mediterranean is the maritime area in which the most intense activity over many millennia has taken place. It's the meeting point of three continents. It's that sort of intensity of activity within the Mediterranean, commercial, political, cultural, religious, all these things, which has made it into a particularly, if you like, great sea.
Not wanting to be rude about your rivals, but I think Brett had some questions for you about Purcell and Horden and about Browdell. So, Brett, do you want to...
Yeah, I mean, one has to be polite about Brodel, of course, but yeah, all right. I will gladly, I will have a go, yeah.
I wanted to draw this out in part because it seems to me, at least perhaps on this side of the pond, that your book hasn't, it has made a splash, but perhaps not the splash I would like. So I wanted to bring this out, particularly in contrast to Horden and Purcell's The Corrupting Sea, because they present one model of the Mediterranean, microecologies relatively unchanging. You present their model has been very influential among classicists, quite heavily adopted. I think you present, I would say, quite a different model of understanding the Mediterranean. I was wondering if you could sort of bring out those differences and discuss why you choose a different model and as politely as you like, what you think perhaps are the shortcomings of Horden and Purcell's approach.
Yeah, this book by Horden and Purcell, a massive book, it is a book which is very difficult to make use of.
No kidding.
It contains masses and masses of information and actually getting to the heart of the argument, which is probably better in a way to read some of their essays to understand what they're trying to say. But the real drawback is that it's the first volume of a pair of volumes. We don't know what's going to be in the next volume. It's more than 20 years since The Corrupting Sea came out.
Right.
The second volume, The Liquid Continent, I hope it will have some people in it. That's one of my real people. I mean, now, all right, so where does this take us? Now, I think, first of all, when you talk about the sort of impact that a book like mine has or theirs has, they are aimed at slightly different audiences. Mm-hmm. The Corrupting Sea is a book aimed very much at a student and academic audience. It is, if you like, a research book. And one thing which I think we're particularly proud of in the United Kingdom is that historians, we do try to reach out not just to one another, but also to the wider public. It's something which I regard as terribly important, that we don't just conduct debates among ourselves, though many of my colleagues do precisely that and nothing else, which become more and more technical, more and more bound up, lots of jargon thrown into this. So that attempt to reach two types of audience, well, in a way, three types of audience. You've got the wider public, you've got fellow academics, and you've got the whole sort of student audience as well, who do need an introduction to the history of the Mediterranean. And they're not going, if they read The Corrupting Sea, or indeed Braudel, whose book is built around the events of the late 16th century, they're not actually going to be able to see long-term developments in the Mediterranean at all. Clearly, the Corrupting Sea concentrates exclusively on the ancient and early medieval world, which are the specialities of the two authors. And it's a very remarkable work, of course. And some of the key concepts, the concept of connectivity, of how these micro microecologies develop, how specialization, local specialization, systems of exchange, coping with famine, scarcity as against abundance, all these issues which help us to understand how commercial networks came into being. These are tremendously important. But I think you have to understand that what I was trying to do in a way it's a very different project. What I was trying to do in this book, and also the book about the oceans, the more recent book, was actually to write a history of the sea. Now, you can't actually write a history of the sea without also writing about the ports, without writing about the islands in the middle of the sea, and so on. But actually trying to address the experience that people have in crossing the sea. Now, I'm not terribly interested, I have to say, in things like, conditions on board ship. I say a little bit about it when, what people were eating, things like this. I'm not a great expert on the design of ships. But what I'm really interested in are the people who move across the sea, and actually coming close up to them, looking particularly at the merchants, because these are people who are moving objects across the sea, and also often carrying with them ideas, cultural fashions, religious ideas, and so on. The pilgrims, the slaves, all these people who are moving back and forth. So why they're moving and what impact their movement has, and how it fits into the wider political developments that are taking place. Now, if we go back, take a step back from Horden and Purcell, if we're thinking about Fernand Braudel, the great school of French historians, what we call the Annales school, of which Braudel became, if you like, the high priest in the, I suppose, 1960s, 70s, 80s, towards the end of his life. That was a particular approach which was built around a set of concepts which I find it very difficult to identify with. It seems to me to be encapsulated in this phrase of Braudel, all change is slow. And he has this particular conception of time, the longue durée, the long periods of time in which things are actually not changing very much. I mean, he's not saying that the change doesn't take place, but the changes that matter to him are changes which happen extremely gradually. And I think part of the problem is that he didn't engage. I mean, we started with Alexander. We started with the foundation of Alexandria and thinking about the dramatic effect that had on the way that the Mediterranean sort of functioned from the late 4th century BC onwards, right through to, if you like, 19th, 20th century. So putting people, human agency, at the centre of this account was something which was extremely important in my approach. And so the subtitle of the book, it's The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, and trying to understand how the choices individual human beings have made have transformed the Mediterranean and the areas around its edges. That isn't I mean, I think some of the ideas that we have in Horden and Purcell about these sort of micro-ecologies that enter into a sort of commercial dialogue with one another are indeed perfectly valid. One of the problems that we have, however, both with the Horden-Purcell enterprise and with Braudel, is that it actually moves away often quite rapidly, from the Mediterranean itself. Quite large chunks of the corrupting sea are actually concerned with what is going on land, agricultural productivity issues of this sort. If you're actually trying to write from the perspective of the sea, all right, you've got the produce of the land, you've got the grain, for instance, whatever is being produced, but you're actually dealing with it as it comes into the ports, and you don't get sort of sucked into this analysis which takes you away from the maritime history. I wouldn't call Corrupting Sea really a maritime history, and I wouldn't call Brauddel's Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world a maritime history.
And just speaking about traders, because you mentioned that and the people, I don't know if you recall it, but there seems to be some sort of a text, which is the very first text relating to a trading journey, which seems to be like something out of a holiday from hell, where one thing after another goes wrong for this poor Egyptian trader.
Oh, Wenamun. Yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah, poor man. He's sent by his temple to go and get wood from what's now Lebanon. And everything goes. I mean, he falls in with pirates. The gifts that he's taking to this king are stolen. All sorts of things go desperately wrong. Finally, he's saved by the Queen of Cyprus, but we don't know whether he ever gets back to Egypt. We don't really know whether it's a true story either, it has to be said. But certainly, I mean, you can take out of it information about how contact was being made between Bronze Age Egypt and the Canaanite, sort of pre-Phoenician civilization along the coasts of what are now Lebanon and Israel.
And speaking of stories which we don't quite know if they're true or not, I thought your treatment of the Trojan War was quite interesting because you seemed to give it more credibility or more basis in reality than I've maybe seen in other places. And I wondered if I'd read that right or not.
Well, what I say at one point, no, you are right, I think, but what I say at one point is that we shouldn't really be thinking of sort of one great expedition. We're talking about a whole series of conflicts which over a long period of time erupted around the Dardanelles, the Hellespont, the channel leading towards the Black Sea. And of course, Troy occupied a strategic position, if it's the right place. I mean, we have to be sure, did Schliemann actually discover the city that people were thinking of when they wrote about Troy? I mean, it gets very complicated. Before you know where you are, you can't say anything really about the location of Troy. But there certainly were towns in that area, northwest of what's now Turkey, and we have evidence that the Hittites in the interior and the Mycenaeans, the rulers of Bronze Age Greece, that they did sometimes enter into correspondence about what was going on. There were tensions between these two sides, probably turning not necessarily on that particular corner, a bit further south, Miletos, places like that, where there were Greek invaders, where there was disruption, the locals themselves probably launching pirate attacks in the Aegean and so on. So there were things going on, and the archaeological evidence does show that around 1200 BC, the place that Schliemann thought was Troy was destroyed. So things were certainly happening, but we have to understand that all of this was happening in the context of a much bigger series of upheavals. And you could think of the story of Troy, and possibly also actually the story of the Israelite exodus out of Egypt, as little bits of a much bigger story of this dissolution of Bronze Age civilizations, in the plural, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have these constant references to peoples coming from the sea, though it's now agreed that many of them actually came over land, like the so-called Libyans who invaded Egypt, so around 1200 BC. And we have the names of these peoples. And one of the fascinating things, and here I perhaps in order to tease classicists, I mean, people, classicists tend to be sometimes so cautious. They're right to be cautious, but over-cautious about these names. We've got these extraordinary series of names. Shardana, which reminds us of Sardinia, and we've got others whose name sounds as if they're Sicilians. We've got the Tursha, who I suspect could have come from a place called Taruisha, which might be the same as Troy. We've got these invading peoples, some of them coming by sea. We've got sculptured reliefs in Egyptian tombs showing them, most famously the Peleshet, the Philistines, whom we know from the Bible, who were, as the latest archaeological evidence, including DNA evidence, has shown, these were people who came from the Aegean. They were, I wouldn't say necessarily Mycenaean warriors from Greece, but they came from that world. They produced pottery of that particular style. They worshipped the same sorts of gods, and according to the Bible, came from Crete, which would fit in with that sort of picture, though they obviously, ethnic labels in this period, of course, have to be treated very approximately, as they do also when you're looking at the collapse of the Roman Empire. Huns and Vandals, these are very loose labels, people sort of shifting between categories, joining. They're not necessarily ethnic categories, But there was this period of enormous upheaval. And although one can argue, and I leave this to the classical archaeologists, about whether the so-called Dark Age that followed was as dark as used to be supposed, whether there was some greater degree of continuity than people have generally argued, and when recovery occurred, did it occur earlier in Italy with the Etruscans than in Greece? And some people are beginning to push in that direction. The latest sort of work being published on central northern Italy is certainly heading in that direction. So there's some very interesting questions here. But the story of the fall of Troy, just to sort of sum all that up, is the story of the fall of Troy is, it seems to me, a reflection of a real era of crisis. And it's all right, it's been moulded into this extraordinary tale beginning with, Paris and Aphrodite and Hera, etc., etc. But there actually does seem to be a relationship to reality. So I wouldn't go, I mentioned Moses Finlay, the ancient historian from Cambridge, famous figure. I wouldn't go as far as he used to dismiss all these things as just fantasy. I think we've learned that we can't do that. If you look at other examples of epic literature to compare to Homer, you look at the Song of Roland, for instance, the famous, the French poem Circa 1100, about Charlemagne and his wars against the Saracens, in the Muslims in Spain. Yeah, we know what it's all based on, which was actually an attack by some Basque bandits on the sort of baggage train of Charlemagne's army. And it's elevated, it's expanded into this much bigger story. But you do find sometimes that there is a relationship, that individual names, some of the names from the story of the Trojan War do turn up in these Hittite tablets. Alexandru is the same as Paris and so on, possibly the name of Priam, which that also may be a king somewhere on the western coast of Asia. So there actually is hard evidence, but fitting it all together is something which is still extremely difficult.
Brett, do you have some further questions on sort of we talked about the big divide of the sea peoples where everything sort of entered a dark age, as David put it. But you wanted to explore a bit, I think, about the divisions in the book. Is now a good time to do that?
I think so. One thing that I think was in there that I want to draw out, because it goes back to talking about the Annales School and La Longue Durée and so on, is that this is precisely the kind of event, this late Bronze Age collapse, which just doesn't figure very much into the kind of history that, say, a Braudel or even a Horden and Purcell have written. Their concept for this, right, is that there are periods of intensification and abatement, but they don't allow for periods of actual change. And it seems to me that the late Bronze Age collapse isn't just a period where, connectivity goes down and then it goes back up again, but that the nature of the connectivity changes. The trade we're seeing on the other end of the late Bronze Age collapse looks different. It's the trade in some cases in different stuff. Bronze is inevitably a great motivator of trade because you never find copper and tin in the same place. This is not as important in the Iron Age. And so, this is what I think is one of the great advantages of the Great Sea is that it pulls out these moments where there are qualitative changes, not merely connectivity goes up, connectivity goes down, but the nature of the connectivity has fundamentally changed at this point. And yes, there's still going to be connectivity and there are still microecologies interacting with abundance and scarcity, but something fundamentally about the character of this has changed in a way that can't simply be expressed in terms of an abatement and then an intensification of connectivity. I wanted to sort of pull that out and frame it and put it on my wall.
That's very helpful. And it does seem to me, and this relates this whole question of the 5 different periods in the history of the Mediterranean that I identify. It seems to me that my very first period, in a certain sense, it doesn't really qualify. It's a sort of prehistory. I don't particularly like that term, but I'll use it for the moment. Because if we go back to the Bronze Age or even earlier to the Neolithic, New Stone Age, what we're looking at is, people are moving across the water. We can prove that that's happening. We can show in the Bronze Age that Greek traders, Mycenaean traders, are reaching Sicily and probably getting up to the Bay of Naples occasionally. We can show that Sardinia had some connections in the direction of Spain, but also eastwards as well, possibly even connections into the Atlantic. But what we're not looking at in the Bronze Age is what I call an integrated network in the Mediterranean. And when you get to, the question is, when does this really begin? When you get to the Phoenicians, when you get to, so let's say 800 BC, just to pluck a date out of the air, really, but possibly earlier than that, you've got these merchants, Canaanite merchants, setting out from cities like Tyre and Sidon, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, some of them attributed with dates even before 1000, dates around the time of the fall of Troy. Indeed, we can dismiss that. But you think of, Carthage is the most famous, but I've mentioned Cadiz already in the southwest of Spain, so beyond the entrance into the Mediterranean. And so you've got a significant Phoenician presence on the coasts of southern Spain, as well as along the coast of North Africa. You've got a very significant Phoenician presence in Sardinia, where they've left inscriptions, and the little town Nora, just on the southwest of Sardinia. And they turn up in the Bay of Naples and so on. They're trading with the Etruscans. There's really a lot going on that is encompassing the whole Mediterranean. But if you go back to the Bronze Age, you're really looking, if you want to look for reasonably intensive trading activity, you have to look at the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the further west you go, the more fragmentary the picture becomes. Now, you might say, well, isn't that because the evidence, is spotty, we need to find more evidence, etc. But I think, if you go, there's a book that hasn't been mentioned, which I would like to mention, Cyprian Broodbank, The Making of the Middle Sea, a highly authoritative account of the Mediterranean. He takes it up to the Battle of Salamis in 474 BC, but really I have to say the book, it sort of fades out probably around sort of 600-700 BC. Anyway, his great strength is really the Neolithic and Bronze Age and that so-called Dark Age period. And what I found sort of in a sense unconvincing about really the title of the book, and perhaps it's not fair to quarrel with the title of a book, one has to be very brief in producing a title, the making of the Middle Sea. Actually, what he's talking about is not really its making, because it's only that process of integration which takes place as the Phoenicians begin to span the whole area for the first time, as the Greek and Etruscan merchants also begin to penetrate. You have, Greeks going into Western Mediterranean waters, founding Marseille and trying to gain control of ports on the coasts of Corsica. They're chased away by the Etruscans. You've got all sorts of things happening in the Western Mediterranean, which up to then had been such a sort of patchy picture of sort of various sort of localized connections, but nothing really linking into a big system. So this leads me to think in terms of what I call a first Mediterranean, which really collapses with the fall of the Bronze Age civilization. So we could take the fall of Troy as the great sort of symbol of what's going on there. And then a second Mediterranean, which is marked by this extraordinary recovery. And the recovery is led by the group that I always tend to find myself entwined with in my historical research, the merchants, the Phoenicians. And it's just fascinating to watch how this Phoenician network comes into being and how Carthage develops into a place with very much an identity of its own. It's not like Tyre or Sidon. It actually becomes a great centre actually of agricultural production and so on. And then, of course, that leads to the creation of its own little networks, treaty with the ruler of Caere, the Etruscan city, in 509 around then BC, which has survived, these little gold tablets that have survived in Phoenician and Etruscan, and treaty with Rome around the same period. And we're beginning to see this whole world opening up in a remarkable way. Now, that explains my clear division there. It's a fairly sort of orthodox thing to do, to make that distinction. But I know that one has to be careful about, these dark ages. I mean, the whole question of continuity. I leave that to some extent to the classical archaeologists and issues to do with, the extent to which the pottery produced by the Mycenaean Greeks it continues to be produced in Cyprus. As I said, some of it's still produced by the Philistines on the coast of Palestine. So all these issues of continuity are very much up there in the air. But I do have the sense of quite a decisive break. The loss of the art of writing, actually, in the Greek world. I mean, that is a very interesting index of the collapse of civilization, given that the texts we have from Bronze Age Crete and mainland Greece, these are records of they're very much accounts. They're very much accounts for palaces, for temples, and so on, for kings. And if that all disappears, it gives you some clue to how this world has disintegrated.
Oh, and it disappears with the palaces and the kings. And when our historical vision appears again, you don't have either of those institutions.
No.
I think the sort of change in continuity argument is something you get, obviously, in the Greek Dark Ages. You get it again, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a second, with the collapse of the Roman Empire. And the archaeologists will always point to and say, well, look at the pottery. The same people are living here that have always lived here. And I'm like, yes, that's true. But the French have been living in France for an awfully long period of time. But the French Revolution is still a fairly substantial break in continuity, isn't it?
Yeah.
The pottery didn't change in 1789, but a lot of other things did. And the fact sorry, I was just going to say, the fact that you don't see the reemergence of Bronze Age style political institutions in Greece strikes me as a clear example where there is obviously a break.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. No, issues like pottery, it's an interesting question. To move to the other end of the ancient world, following the invasion of Spain in 711 by by who? The Moor, we call them the Moor. We used to call them the Moors because it's difficult to know whether they really were Muslims or not. But it takes a very long time for the style of pottery, particularly in the countryside, to sort of Islamize itself. And that's the sort of thing, that one has to bear in mind. We're dealing with different types of population, and we're dealing sometimes with different ethnic groups, and things are going to move at different speeds with these different groups. There may be a great deal of inbuilt conservatism, particularly when it comes to styles of pottery, which is often the very best evidence we have archaeologically.
Are we done on the divisions in time? Because I know we're kind of, we're running on now, and it's been very interesting. But there's one or two things I'd like to go on to discuss. Do people have a topic that they particularly want to get to? Because I thought I might talk a little bit about Christianity, and I was also interested in David's book, this question of how in the early days it seems like Judaism and Christianity are competitors in a way that I hadn't previously understood. So is that something to talk about now, or is there something else we should talk about first?
I'm happy to talk about that. One way of approaching this is to think of the Mediterranean in terms of this constant, in the Roman period, this constant movement of people, this constant movement of merchants, bringing ideas which have, in these two cases, we're talking about Judaism and Christianity, of course, Christianity has emerged out of Judaism in this small corner of the Mediterranean, and yet that spreads right across it and gets official recognition in the 4th century. But part of the issue is precisely that Christianity had grown out of Judaism, and people were not always very clear in their minds. If you're looking at, the ordinary Christian or the ordinary Jew, they weren't always very clear in their minds where the boundary between these different religious beliefs lay. And this is even the case when you get into not just the period of Constantine, but even after that. There's a marvellous phrase that Robin Lane Fox comes up with, the Oxford ancient historian: synagogue on Saturday, church on Sunday. So people moving between these different religious beliefs. And sometimes, particularly in the Jewish context, where particularly for men who wanted to become Jews, there was a bit of a sort of barrier, which was the question of circumcision. So if they hadn't been circumcised as children, they probably might have reservations about doing it later. But we know that there were quite a lot of these, well, I'm going to call them hangers-on. That's a very impolite way of people who would attend, they weren't full members of the community, but they identified with it. And this included actually people very high up in the Roman elite. In the pagan period, you'd have the wives of senators, talk of Poppaea, Nero's wife, being interested in Judaism and so on. So it's a well-established phenomenon. And with the coming of Christianity, in a sense, it's only accentuated because, as I say, there are these very fuzzy boundaries between the different religions. And the great case of this is in the year 418, when we have this mass conversion of the Jews of Minorca. Now, Minorca was the back of beyond, and our account of this conversion was left by the local bishop, who actually hated the place. He was a friend of St. Augustine, the great North African prelate, one of the great thinkers of late antiquity. And so we have a little bit of correspondence between him and Augustine, but we have this extraordinary letter. And so you shouldn't believe everything in it, but he describes how the island of Minorca, there were basically two religious communities, a large number of Christians and a very large number of Jews. And the Jews actually occupied a number of sort of administrative positions on the island. Some of them had very good connections to the Roman elite, actually to leading generals in the Roman army, which again points to these fuzzy boundaries, because we're not suggesting these generals were Jewish, but nonetheless, they had Jewish wives or whatever. So he talks about how there was great familiarity, I think that's the word he uses, between the Jews and the Christians. But then also a sort of resentment built up among the Christians. And this was bound up with a sort of visitation made by the long-dead St. Stephen, whose relics were being carried around the Mediterranean. The arrival of the relics of St. Stephen stimulated the Christian population it sort of made them more conscious of their separate identity. They tended to live in the west of the island, around the old capital, what we now call Ciutadella. Those days were known as Yamona. And the Jews tended to live in what is now the capital, Maon, Magona, as it was known in antiquity. So the Christians all sort of marched en masse on Yamona, and they accused the Jews of salting away arms, for what purpose not entirely clear, and it later became obvious that the Jews were not doing that anyway. But they put enormous pressure on the Jews. Things turned a bit ugly, and the synagogue was raided and things like this, and Jews started converting in large numbers. This included eventually even a man called Theodore, who was the sort of leader of the Jewish community. And, if the leaders converted, that tended to act as a spur to a lot of that's how it tended to operate in the ancient medieval world. You try to sort of target the leaders, knowing that their followers, their sort of the members of their clientela, would probably go in the same direction. And so at the end of all this, there'd been this mass conversion, various miracles taking place, according to Bishop Severus in his letter. But what is really interesting about this is, on the one hand, we have a picture of conflict between the communities emerging almost out of nowhere. But on the other hand, there's another level to the account, which shows this extraordinary familiarity between the two groups. And one also has to bear in mind that up to about this point, and this is where imperial legislation made it impossible really for this to continue, Judaism was to a much greater extent than subsequently a proselytizing religion. It was actually going out to get converts, as Christianity was. But the Christians,
Did Christians become Jewish? Was that possible?
It wasn't. It could have got them into serious trouble by this period, by the year 418. But if you were to go further back in time, you would have had people moving back and forth between. They might have been, well, as I say, not just on Saturdays and Sundays, but somebody might spend several years living in the Jewish community, and then, goodness knows, perhaps through marriage, might get attracted into Christianity, and then sort of wander back. You have to think in terms of much more fluid series of relationships than nowadays, without the sort of hard lines that religions and sects have nowadays. There were, of course, sects within Christianity, and some of them were very hard line. There were the Marcionites, who considered that the Old Testament was written by the devil, which is a bit problematic in relation to the New Testament, actually. But anyway, there were these groups. And then also we have to factor in some of those groups which we've got the pagans who are still active. The pagan schools in Athens only being closed down in the 6th century. So it's quite a sort of cocktail of different beliefs. And still, because of the controversies in the church about the exact nature of the Trinity and so on, there's sort of a great deal of coming and going between the different sects.
I suppose one of the problems we have, and I guess as historians you will be very aware of this, is that we know now how everything turned out. So we know how the religions developed, and it's very hard to put yourself back in the mind of somebody in, say, 300 and see the world as they saw it and the boundaries that they saw. And as you say, it'd be much more fuzzy to them than it is to us, because we see it through a particular pair of glasses.
Yes, I think one of the things which Judaism and Christianity had in common was quite a similar sort of ethical code. It was the case that Judaism perhaps made more demands in terms of ritual sort of daily life. But again, we also have to consider that we're not looking at the sort of Judaism that, developed in the Middle Ages, and which, you can still see signs of among sort of ultra-Orthodox Jews nowadays. The key texts of Jewish law were still being written. They were coming into existence, but they hadn't been widely diffused. I mean, you could really argue that they weren't widely diffused until about the 10th century or even later. So people are living in a much less sort of, if you like, controlled environment where there are these specific requirements laid down on Jewish practice and equally for Christian practice. You have to remember that the whole concept of the Eucharist and things like this, the Mass, the theology of that was still developing in this period. As I said, this is the age of St. Augustine, who is formulating some of the fundamental ideas of Christian theology, but they haven't yet become diffused. So it's a world, it's a fuzzy, shadowy sort of world of religious interaction.
And it's also worth remembering just that we don't forget that, of course, Christianity and Judaism were not the only sort of Eastern Mediterranean religions beginning to bounce around the Western Mediterranean. Of course, you have Apuleius and his Isis worship. You have Mithras making his way through the Roman army. This is clearly a period really throughout the Roman Empire where, having brought the Mediterranean into a degree of political unity and increased trade, there's clearly increased flow of ideas, and all of these religious ideas are moving around, cross-pollinating in interesting ways, showing up in interesting and unexpected places. Having a small shrine to Mithras show up on the Rhine, Mithras being an Indo-Iranian deity. He's pretty far from home in Germany.
And even the Emperor Constantine. I mean, the Arch of Constantine in Rome, no reference to Christianity at all.
None.
Politically, it would not have been a wise thing to have done because the Senate was uniformly pagan. But he was obviously, even though he presided over the Council of Nicaea, he really was an ignoramus when it came to these doctrinal matters. And we're not even sure, well, it looks as if he became a Christian technically on his deathbed.
Right. I think it's useful to understand Constantine's actions right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he's supposedly had the victory delivered to him by the Christian God. You can understand his actions very well if you assume that he's being very traditionally Roman. I have all of these gods. There's this other god. He did me a big favor. I vowed him a temple, which his followers, for some weird reason, call a church. And so I built one, and then we're just going to move on. And now this is one more god that I've got in my pocket, and presumably, he has Christian family members are trying to explain to him that it doesn't quite work that way. Clearly, it took a while for the message to sink in.
Yeah. I mean, his mother, of course,
right,
was keen on Christianity, but found the true cross and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But
they're always finding the true cross.
Yeah, but you see it again and again. I mean, it's exactly the same with the Vikings, people like that, centuries later. That actually understanding that worshipping this particular god excludes all the other gods. That the three Abrahamic religions are exclusive in that respect. Doesn't come to people very easily.
No.
So, have we got anything more to say before we close off, or are we done for the evening?
No, I mean, obviously there's the whole question of the fall of the Roman Empire, but that can be dealt with, I think, in the context of the emergence of the medieval Mediterranean.
Brett, do you have anything else? Do you have any final word?
No, I think we can put a bow on it and call it done.
Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. That was a real pleasure. So thank you so much, David, and thank you so much, Brett.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.